This is the place for history on KY3 with Gary Kramer, the State Historical Society of Missouri, and you have written books on George Washington Carver, and I've looked at your books. I checked out not all of them on Carver. This one on Carver. I've checked out your books from the library. A lot about Missouri history too, and that's your background. I think the best place to start with George Washington Carver. I grew up in Missouri, and the thing we usually start with in history class is this is the peanut guy. Uh, but his roots in Missouri, uh, he starts out in this part of the state, and then you tell me the story. It was really a tough childhood in Missouri.
Yeah, we will probably never know exactly when George Washington Carver was born. Uh, and that in itself is interesting because uh, he was born an enslaved person, and there was no record kept of slave births or deaths. Um, we think he was born very near the end of the Civil War, probably in 1864, but he and his mother were kidnapped by bushwhackers when he was about 6 months old, taken probably down into Arkansas, and his master tried to retrieve young George and George's mother, was successful in retrieving George, but George never knew his mother. And it's interesting because throughout his life, George often referred to himself as the orphan child of a despised race. That in itself, I think, was a really difficult thing for him throughout his life. He never knew his mother. He had an older brother, and he and his brother grew up on the Carver farm in southwest Missouri near Diamond. Uh, but he really, he had no close family members. His brother died when his brother was fairly young, um, and um, and again, he was without a connection to a family. Um, and of course, he grew up in a Missouri after the Civil War that was racially segregated. Missouri law prohibited blacks and whites from attending the same schools, for example. There was a white school near George's home, but he could not attend it. Uh, he was a precocious child. He was sickly, and because he was sickly, uh, he often escaped the chores, the farm chores that his older brother Jim was required to do. And instead of that, he spent a lot of time indoors with Mrs. Carver, um, and and I think that in many ways, I think that explains a lot about Carver. Carver, I think, was influenced throughout his life far more by women than men,
Mm.
and he had because of that, he learned the domestic chores that were associated with uh, the female head of the household. He learned how to cook. He learned how to clean. He learned how to do laundry. He learned how to iron. He learned how to sew and mend. And he also learned how to garden. And it seems to have been the garden that was his source of solace, his respite. But throughout his young life, after he left Missouri, he would make his living uh, through those domestic chores that he had learned how to do under, as he called her, Aunt Susan, taking in laundry, doing ironing, cooking, and so forth. Um, it seems as though Mrs. Carver gave him some exposure to education, taught him to read and write. Uh, but Mr. and Mrs. Carver seemed also to understand that there was something special about this young man.
Mm.
Uh, and when he learned that there was a black school 8 or 9 miles away in Neosho, they encouraged him to go to that school. Now, mind you, we don't know exactly how old he was, but he was certainly an adolescent, the age of some of my grandkids. And I think about my grandkids heading off by themselves, walking 8 miles to go to school and to find a place to live. And I think of what a daunting challenge that must have been. I think he had been to Neosho a time or two, perhaps on trips with Mr. and Mrs. Carver for the purchase of goods of some kind, supplies. But, it's still incredible to me that this young man could take off hiking uh, 8 or 10 miles with no certainty that he was going to have a place to stay or that he was even going to be able to get into the school that he had heard about. But that's what he leaves home and he never really comes back except for an occasional visit. And again, he's an adolescent or a young teenager.
So he's a young man finding a way to get education in a segregated society. He doesn't have his mother and father have both died, siblings have died. Somehow he manages to go to college, but not as an 18-year-old. He's a little bit older than that because he wanders. Is that right?
We call him a non-traditional student. From the very beginning, he finds a barn to stay in, to sleep, which happens to be very near the school that he hopes to attend. And the childless Black couple who owned that barn took him in. And again, from the very beginning, he exchanged work for room and board. But I think that couple had a tremendous effect on him. First of all, they were very religious, and you cannot understand George Washington Carver without understanding his deep spirituality and his deep sense of religiousness, not necessarily organized religion, not a traditional Christian church. Some have argued that Carver was almost a pantheist, that he tended to see God in nature. And throughout his life, he talked often about early morning walks where he communed with God through nature, talking to God through the plants and the trees and so forth that God had created. But he really got a very clear upbringing in religion with Aunt Mariah Watkins, who was also a midwife. When I first started doing work on Carver in the Ozarks, I would periodically encounter someone who referred to themselves as one of Aunt Mariah's babies. They were an elderly adult who had been delivered by Aunt Mariah Watkins, and for whom that was a significant experience. But Carver discovered the school, and he went to the school for a while. We don't know exactly how long. The school has actually been rediscovered and is being restored in the town of Neosho. It was encased in another building, and only in the past few years has it been discovered that there was this building within a building that Carver actually attended school there. But he quickly learned that the schoolmaster was not much better educated than he. I have encountered instances in the post-Civil War period in Missouri where the exam that a Black teacher had to take might be as simple as reciting their ABCs. So Carver really was discouraged by this experience. And in the late 1880s, he decided to leave and go to Kansas in search of more education. This is speculative, but I think he may have hitched a ride with a group of people who were referred to by historians as exodusters. After the Compromise of 1877, which included the federal government pulling white troops out of the South that were there to protect the Black exercise of the franchise and civil rights, after that, home rule was restored in the South. And many of these home rule governments were very racist and very hostile toward Blacks. And many Blacks responded by fleeing the South, coming up the Mississippi River and then heading west overland to the promised land of Kansas. They regarded it as the promised land because of its historical association with John Brown. And so there is at least some evidence that he joined a group of people traveling through the Ozarks to Fort Scott, Kansas he was certainly in Fort Scott by 1879, where he tried to go to school and tried to make a living doing these domestic chores. But in 1879, he witnessed a lynching in Fort Scott that many years later he would write about as a truly horrible, frightening experience. I can only imagine. And so that caused him to leave Fort Scott. And so he bounced around eastern Kansas, even going as far as Ness County, Kansas, to Homestead at one point in the 1880s, where he tried to eke out an existence on this recalcitrant prairie land that was often without sufficient rain. But we know relatively little about his years in the 1880s until he resurfaces in Winterset, Iowa. I mean, he does, we know some of the places he was, and we know the land records where he homesteaded, but we don't know a lot of details. We know that he made a living again doing these domestic chores, but he shows up in Winterset, Iowa, where there was a college, Simpson College, and his own account of this indicates that he often he would go to a church when he entered a community. And so he shows up in this church, and at least one account of his experience indicates that he just starts singing with the choir. And the lady who was in charge of the choir was impressed. And of course, he's the only Black person there. She invited him home to Sunday dinner, and she and her husband happened to be a prominent local physician. And they, I think by this time, he had become a self-taught artist. I think he was also a self-taught musician. He played a guitar, and they were just taken by this young man who by now, is well into his 20s. And they encouraged him. I think he must have shared with them some of his drawings. And so they encouraged him to go to nearby Winterset, Iowa, and enroll in Simpson College. Now, what I neglected to say is that a few years prior to that, he had an experience in Kansas where he tried to enroll at Highland College in eastern Kansas. And he was accepted sight unseen. But when he showed up, he was told that the school did not admit people of color. And so when the Milhollans, who were his newfound supporters in Winterset, Iowa, when they began to encourage him to go to school, he was very reluctant, having experienced the embarrassment and the frustration of being turned away once in the recent past. He said, no, I don't want to try that. But they prevailed on him to do so.
Without this couple in Iowa helping him, this great mind might not have been expanded because of the racism and segregation of the time. This wonderful brain that brought us so many innovations would have not brought us those innovations.
And in fact, this is one of the characteristics of Carver's life, one of the continuing things that he was, on more than one occasion, befriended by white people who saw something special in him. So in Winterset, Iowa, it's Dr. and Mrs. Milholland who encourage him to go to Simpson College. He eventually decides to go, but he wants to major in art. And he's loving it. But one of his instructors, Miss Etta Budd, becomes concerned how is a Black man going to make a living as an artist in a relatively a much hostile white world? She was aware of his fascination with plants. Her father happened to be a professor at Iowa State College in Ames, Iowa. And so she encourages this young Black man, George Washington Carver, to go to Iowa State and to continue his artwork as a hobby, but to major in biology or botany or something that would have a better chance of getting him a job. And so eventually he decides to go to Iowa State, where he is the only Black person, probably very few Black people in town, and the only Black person on the Iowa State campus. Initially, he's ostracized. In fact, at one point, he sends a letter back to a friend who had befriended him, a white woman in Winterset, Iowa, not Mrs. Milholm, but somebody else, writes to her about his difficulties he's having on campus. As he reports the story, she gets on a train and comes to Ames, Iowa, and this white woman walks around the campus holding his hand as if to illustrate to people, this is not somebody you need to be afraid of. And then a group of white students who befriended him and understood that he was struggling financially began to encourage people to bring their laundry and their knitting and their sewing to him. And so it's really that experience. And then these white professors began to take him under their arms. And pretty soon, Iowa State becomes a place that he falls in love with. And he stays there through the completion of an undergraduate degree. And then when he finishes an undergraduate degree, this white group of professors encourage him to stay and work on a graduate degree in agriculture, which means that when he graduates in 1896, I think, he is the only African American in the country with a graduate degree in agriculture.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. The only one.
Yeah. And that somehow Booker T. Washington becomes aware of this. And so Booker T. Washington tries to recruit Carver to come down to Tuskegee. And actually there's a series of kind of humorous interactions here because Carver frankly tried to play hard to get. And in fact, at one point he borrows one of his professor's letterhead. And he writes a note to Booker T. Washington. He says, you can tell by my letterhead that I have a prominent position here. And he holds out. And eventually, Booker T. Offers him the munificent sum of $1,000 a year plus room and board on the campus of Tuskegee. And so Carver decides to go south to Tuskegee, Alabama, to take a job. Now, remember that Carver had never been south. Carver had really been around relatively few other African Americans. And he's going to a county which is 90% Black and to a Black school. And what he doesn't understand about Booker T. Washington is that Booker T. Washington rules Tuskegee with an iron fist.
And despite this clash with his boss, he does spend the rest of his life basically right there. And he travels, of course, but and one of those travels is to a hearing on tariffs on peanuts. And this is not a man who's 20 or 30. He's firmly in middle age. And what happens when he goes to testify on this situation with tariffs and peanuts?
Yeah, by this time he's in his 50s. And let me back up just a second, though. Carver did resign several times.
Oh, he did. Okay.
I think Booker T would just take the letters and put them in his drawer. And he knew that within a few days, Carver would get over whatever it was that was bothering him. and he would rescind his request or his resignation. In 1921, by 1921, Carver had become fairly well known for a variety of things associated with his effort at conserving the soil and helping the South escape from really the one crop mentality of cotton. He had tried through his work with trying to, he knew that the soils needed to be replenished, but he also knew that these poor Southern farmers could not afford commercial fertilizers. So he began to experiment with ways to nourish the soil through green manure, through compost, and through plowing back into the soil nitrogen-rich plants like the peanut. But he also was concerned about the Southern diet and the lack of the presence of pellagra and the lack of protein in the Southern diet. So he was looking, the peanut became a multifaceted way to improve Southern life, a new source of nutrition and protein, but also a source of fertilizing the soil. So he's becoming known. And in 1921, the House Ways and Means Committee held a hearing on its effort to create a tariff on peanuts to protect domestic peanuts from foreign imported peanuts. And Carver goes to Washington, D.C. at the request of this committee, which was chaired by a white Southerner. And remember that in 1921, the capital is highly segregated. Washington, D.C. is a very segregated city. And initially, Carver met with a somewhat hostile audience, met with racial jibes. People, as he begins to put his specimens out and his various materials, one congressman said to him, "Do you want a watermelon to go with that?" And that kind of pejorative comment. And Carver ignored it all, and he just charmed these people with his folksy, down-to-earth style. And initially, he only had a few minutes. Then the number of minutes was extended, and eventually somebody on the committee says, "Mr. Chairman, I think we should give him all the time he needs." But that experience was widely reported in the press, and that was, I think, the beginning of the recognition of Carver as a folk hero. And out of that came a lot of publicity. There was also, at about this time, Carver was interviewed by somebody at the New York Times about his scientific approach. Carver did not approach science in the way most people did. There's a long argument about how women approach science differently than men and about their ability to identify with the subject being studied. I think it's speculative, but I think to some extent Carver approached science the way he did because of his exposure and influence, heavily influenced by women. But he was very mystical. I interviewed a woman one time who said she was in an audience where Carver spoke, and he brought a sweet potato, and he set the sweet potato on the podium, and he started off his lecture by saying, sweet potato, what are you?" And he actually identified with the sweet potato and alleged that the sweet potato in some way told him about its qualities and characteristics. So the New York Times picked this up and wrote a scathing editorial titled something like "Men of Science Don't Speak That Way." And Carver wrote a response. And in the response, he was unrepentant. And he went through a litany of things that he knew, books he had read and scientific methodologies he was aware of. And then he concluded by saying, "But I still talk that way. I still do science that way. You're not going to defeat me." So, and a lot of it was religious because, again, he believed that God spoke to him through these plants. And the point I'm trying to make here is that by the early 1920s, he becomes a kind of a mythological figure almost because of his ability to deal with these white Southern congressional leaders, but he also becomes a hero to the Christian, uh, uh, the supporters of Christianity. And so a number of Christian publications picked up his comments about God speaking to him directly and science being something that could be learned both through revelation and experimentation. And so he's getting publicity everywhere. And so two organizations in the South, the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, and the CIC, the Congress on Interracial Cooperation, decide that they can capitalize on this and that they can use Carver to go into the South on a speaking tour and speak to young YMCA male groups in the hope that his humor and his personality and his lack of threatening posture will have a positive influence on race relations. And so Carver in the 20s starts on this circuit throughout the South, going to YMCA camps of young men 15 to 25 years old, white. And invariably, he speaks to these groups, and there are these young men who become enthralled with him. They go up to him afterwards. They ask him if they can write to him. He establishes these correspondence. In one of my books on Carver, the first book, Carver in His Own Words, there's a chapter titled Carver and His Boys. Yes.
There it is right there. I was just looking it up in your book.
And it's an amazing correspondence. By this time, this guy's in his 60s now, and he's corresponding with these young men, 15 to 20, 25 years old. And they're intense, personal conversations. And they're not just one-sided. He is sharing things about himself with them. And he begins to invite these young men to his room, his home at Tuskegee, which is still an all-Black institution. And some of these kids would show up and stay for several days or a week. And in the late, I was fascinated by this.
Yes.
In the late 1980s, I tracked some of these boys down and interviewed them. And actually, the book you showed at the beginning, Carver and His Boys, there is a second edition of that book, which has a concluding chapter about some of these interviews I did. What struck me in these interviews was that by this time, Carver had been dead nearly 50 years, certainly more than 40 years. But these men, now old, spoke of him with a reverence and an obvious love that could not be mistaken. One of these men, John Crichton, who later went to Columbia University, got a PhD, and ended up in Columbia, Missouri, teaching history. I knew Crichton pretty well. I interviewed him about this. And, he would talk about Carver with tears rolling down his cheeks. And he asked me if he could read a poem on this interview I was doing, this oral history, because he said Carver would take us, his boys, into his study, his room, and read poetry to us. And one of the poems that he remembered best, it wasn't actually a poem. There's a book by a Harlem Renaissance writer named James Weldon Johnson, who Carver was very fond of. And this book, God's Trombones, is really not exactly poetry. It's collections of orations, of sermons. And one of these was one that Carver loved to read to these young men. It's a sermon titled Go Down Death. And in this sermon, God tells Death to get on his white stallion and ride down to Savannah, Georgia, and rescue Sister Sarah, who's living a life of drudgery. And so the poem or the oration is about that experience. And so Dr. Crichton is reading this poem to me, and tears are rolling down his eyes as if it was yesterday that Carver was reading this to him. was a very moving experience for me, and obviously for Dr. Crichton.
I appreciate your time today.
Been my privilege and my pleasure. Thank you so much for asking.
All right. This is the Place for History on KY3.